Postcards from a Dying World, the podcast. For more than a decade, I've reviewed over 1,000 books that are mostly science fiction, horror, and bizarro. This feed will feature bonus audio I have produced over the years, as well as a monthly digest of reviews based on what I've read each month, plus the occasional bonus material about my own fiction. Thanks for listening. Okay, joining me on Postcards from a Dying World is the co-author of The Living Dead, Daniel Kraus. Daniel, welcome to the podcast. It's exciting to have you here.
Hey, thank you so much.
All right, so we're going to get into generally like where you came from and how you got into things before we get into the book. But you've been a horror fiction fan and a George Romero fan pretty much your whole life, right?
Yeah, very early.
Yeah. And so what, and I remember, I think I read that Night of the Living Dead was your first horror movie or first movie that you remember watching.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, no doubt that I saw something before then, but the first movie I remember watching is Night of the Living Dead. Yeah, it's the first one that stuck with me. And I was probably 5 or 6 years old. I was very young.
All right. So, but being that you're into not just filmmaking, but you've written several books, I'm sure you had writers that you grew up on, besides the filmmakers. Who were some of the formative writers for you growing up?
Well, I mean, to start with, and I'll cheat a little bit here, is well, I really grew up on two things from a very young age: Night of the Living Dead and Twilight Zone.
Mm-hmm.
And they were both just always on. Night of the Living Dead because of the copyright issue with it, so it was always on TV, and Twilight Zone because it was syndicated, and my mom would watch it every Friday night or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say the first writer in a way was Rod Serling and Tim Matheson, and the people who really wrote a lot for that show. But once we start talking about actual books, there's probably no one really until Stephen King, maybe in 5th or 6th grade. Before that, I was, mostly like other kids. I was always interested in horror stuff, but I was, kind of wandering around. And then in middle school, Clive Barker was a big one for me. He kind of really blew my mind. Like he was the guy who opened up what was possible. I mean, I think there's something about Stephen King that's very approachable.
Mm.
I think that's obviously why he's so popular. And I grew up in a very small town, so it was very accessible. But Clive Barker was like opening up a window to an entirely different universe. Like his ideas were so wild, and he was coming at them from a perspective that was nothing like mine.
So were we talking late 80s, Clive Barker, like?
Yeah, so let's see. Oh, definitely. Would have been late 80s. Yeah, that's right. So I remember Books of Blood, Inhuman Condition, like the short story collections. My favorite novel of his, the one that really got me hooked, was Weave World, Damnation Game. Although I was a little young for that, I could barely follow it.
Yeah, so I think you and I and Jeremy Robert Johnson are all in that sweet spot where, as young kids, we were reading this stuff way ahead of time, way earlier than we should have. And judging from your shirt, I'm sure we were all Fangoria kids, and that's a lot. That's a lot of it. We had a horror host. I know you grew up in Iowa, correct?
Right.
Yeah, so I'm a Midwesterner too. I'm from Indiana, and we had a horror host, Sammy Terry, who was our gateway. And of course, because of the copyright thing, Sammy Terry showed Night of the Living Dead yearly. And so it was like one of those things that it was formative for me too. I was definitely, I think Dawn of the Dead was one of the early horror movies I rented on Betamax. So for me, the Romero zombie stuff was very formative as well. And but we'll get back to that. But early in your career, one of the first ones I remember noticing of your writings was Monster Variations, which is horror YA, and you kind of made your name writing these young adult horror novels. How did you get into that, and where did Monster Variations come from?
I got into it being young adult literature completely by accident. I just wrote Monster Variations as a book. And it was sort of my Ray Bradbury homage. I was going through a heavy Ray Bradbury phase. And then when I got an agent, the agent was sort of like, I think we should sell this as young adult. So I said, fine. And he did. And then kind of how publishing generally works, or at least in the big publishers, often your editor will have a first look at your next book. And so that's why the next few books of mine were all young adult, is that I would write something. And certainly for the next, I think 3 or 4 books I had, they all could have gone adult. They could have been published as an adult, as easily as a young adult. But the characters were young, which made them, it made it possible to consider them as young adult if you wanted to. In fact, one of my books, Scholar, when I turned that into Random House, there was a lot of discussion about that, which way to publish it. And they even talked about at one point publishing it as both, which was a crazy idea. But you know,
or different
I don't know.
parts?
It never got that far. It was
Okay.
decided early on that was a confusing idea for everyone.
Right.
So anyway, my young editors just kept buying my book. I did keep writing about young characters. Even in my adult stuff, I tend to write about young characters. So something about that is appealing to me. I don't know exactly what it is. So yeah, that's where I got my start.
Yeah, and you had success with one of them. Rotters was nominated for the Stoker Award as well. Was this the work that got the attention of Guillermo del Toro and got you in the Trollhunter Shape of Water business, or?
Yeah. So Rotters was my second book, and that was really the one that opened up all the doors. It was just a popular book with book people, like a lot of editors, those and other writers, those type of people somehow found it. So I just met a lot of people very quickly all of a sudden who wanted to work with me in various ways. So that did directly lead to me working with Guillermo on Trollhunters,
which sounds like I mean, he's one of my favorite directors, so I can imagine working with Guillermo was an amazing experience. With and of course one that went on to win Best Picture is pretty cool. Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about the experience of working with Guillermo and that collaboration? And did that inform how you ended up collaborating with a kind of invisible collaborator with George?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I think we worked on Trollhunters first. And so most people know that from the Netflix show, but it began as a novel. And I did learn some things from him, and the biggest thing was really, I was at that stage coming off of Rotters and especially Scholar. I was writing things that were very bleak, particularly Scholar, which is just really an intense book. And I think my life was sort of intense at that point. And then in came Guillermo and this other project, which was had its dark elements, but it was so much lighter and so much more fun. And the kind of thing that I might have had no interest in before, but it really opened my eyes to the possibility of having optimism and how that can actually be an okay thing in fiction. And it really changed how I approach some things in my writing. I thought, all right, it's okay to give people hope and humor sometimes, and all these other things that I had been really pretty studiously avoiding. And the process of Shape of Water was different, because that was an idea that began with me and then became the screenplay and the novel and the movie. So that was a very different process and a much stranger process. As like you said, the movie went on to great success, and going to film festivals and the Oscars and all that stuff was certainly nothing that I ever expected it to do.
Right. Now, did I hear you correct? Because I'm not sure that did your project did your work with Guillermo in Shape of Water precede the screenplay, or
No, they're sort of simultaneous.
kind of like 2001?
Exactly like 2001. Yeah, that's the only other uh, example that I feel is similar to it. Yeah, I mean the thing was based on an idea I had as a kid. Um, and I'd always intended to write it as a novel, but it was always just kind of a little seed of an idea. I didn't have much around it. And then I told it to Guillermo, who loved it, and then he wrote the screenplay, and we were going to write the book. And then he, we used his screenplay as sort of the structural element that we mainly based the book on. But meanwhile, I've been working on all these other ideas, so I was able to fill the book with those other things that I had been thinking about all these years. And then they came out very close to one another.
Right. Well, and I think that a lot of people get the kind of impression that this was an idea that had been floating around Guillermo's head forever because of his love for the creature of the Black Lagoon, right? But
Well, I think that's fair too, though. I mean,
yeah,
the concept of the what comes from me is the concept of a creature from Black Lagoon type creature in a lab, and then a janitor type person seeing the creature and building some sort of affinity with it, and then busting it out, putting it in her tub. But Guillermo, meanwhile, had been trying, I think, for years to come up with a story involving the creature, or a Black Lagoon type creature. It had been circling around it for many years, I think. So I think I more or less provided the entry point, like a sort of backdoor way into the story that he hadn't considered.
Oh, and by the way, I think Bed Heavens, your book Bed Heavens looks amazing, and that's on my list. I might have to have you back when when I read that, because it's one that I'm going to catch up to, but I think it's a really cool concept. But yeah, so I would imagine the working on the Shape of Water too, and the notoriety that it got didn't hurt the process of getting The Living Dead as a gig. But you also had a personal connection going back to high school, which played a role in that too. So can you talk about how this project of The Living Dead kind of first percolated?
Oh, you're talking about Romero's manager, like
Yeah.
that type of angle? Yeah, yeah. So yeah, to kind of go way back, I grew up in a small town in Iowa, and it's not a place that a lot of people come out of and become artists, or working, full-time artists. That's pretty rare. Um, so I was just going about my life and writing, and maybe at this point 12, 13 years ago, somewhere in there. Um, I was reading an article about George Romero, because of course I was a huge fanatic, and saw mentioned in the article that George Romero's manager was this guy Chris Rowe, and I had gone to high school in that small little town with a guy named Chris Rowe. I thought, is there any chance this is the same guy? And I looked into it, and it was, and I contacted him, and we reconnected. We didn't know each other well, but he was a little older than me. Um, and he said, "Hey, next time I'm in town with George. I live in Chicago. Let's all get together." And so I think later that year they were in town for some horror convention, and the three of us got together, and it was great. And it was really the only time I met George. And then that was kind of it. And then another decade passed, and during that decade, I had some success. I worked with Guillermo a couple times and published a bunch of my own books, and then George died in summer of 2017, And about a month later is when I get this call out of the blue from Chris again, who I haven't, really talked to in a decade. And it was, it was him and his and George's wife, his widow. Um, and they had this partial manuscript that George had been working on for a long time. And they wanted to know if I was interested in trying to complete it. One thing they knew about me personally was that I was a real student of Romero. Like I had been carefully reading his books like holy texts, not his books, his movies like holy texts all of my life, not just the zombie ones, but all of them. And then professionally, of course, I had done a couple of successful collaborations. So I think I was someone that they thought might be a good fit.
Yeah, certainly. And one thing that I haven't seen anyone ask you before, but I'm interested in is being that you had this great two collaborations with another fantastic genre bending and defining horror writer. Did you at any point reach out to Guillermo for advice on how to um, kind of translate a director's vision
Hmm.
into this doorstop of a novel?
No, I don't think I did, but I do remember at the Venice Film Festival having dinner and sitting next to Guillermo and telling him about it.
Mhm.
Um, like it might have been something that I think it must have just happened, um, and him being excited about it. But no, I don't think we ever spoke in any deep way about it.
Oh, that's cool. Well, it is. I'm sure it's exciting for him to know that somebody he's working with too is working on this type of project. I mean, everybody wanted to see George's vision, finished,
Yeah,
and that's a very small fraternity. Those masters of horror. That.
yeah, right. Yeah, it is. Yeah, and I feel lucky to know or have worked with a couple of them. Definitely. I mean, these are definitely my people. And Romero, of course, he is the person for me, my favorite artist.
Mhm. Well, so let's talk a little bit more about that before we get specifically into the book, because I think one thing that um, and a lot of the talk about this, nobody's really drilled down entirely on your feelings on. Now we have a completed filmography for George Romero, and
Hmm.
you did a really good job of listing a lot of the projects that people like you and I who followed over the years, the starts and stops, things that didn't happen. For example, the I don't know, years and different variations of Romero's version of The Stand that we didn't get and almost got. But I'm wondering, like, what do you think are the most underrated films in Romero's canon? Because to me, for example, like I personally believe, like The Dark Half, for example, is one of his most assured films, and is one that's really up there. I'm just wondering if you have
Yeah,
any ones
yeah,
that
I
you like
do.
to drill down
I
on.
mean, the sort of like reflex answer to this for most people is Martin. But I think Martin is generally considered to be a fantastic film. It's just so unavailable that most people haven't seen it. So you can't stream it or anything. There hasn't been a DVD out of it in the US for, I don't know, 15, 20 years. I mean, it's been a long time. But everyone who's seen it, though, kind of agrees that it's a great film. To me, his most underrated film is his last film, Survival of the Dead, which I really love. And I'm sort of in the rare few, but I just can't get enough of that movie. I just find it um, extremely thoughtful and subtle, and I think it's something that really rewards multiple viewings. Like it really creeps up on it. Like the first time I saw it, I really liked it, but it took the second and third viewings for me to become a super fan of it. Um, so yeah, I would say Survival of the Dead is my first answer. Um, Season of the Witch is really good. I think that's still fairly underseen. Um, I don't think he made a bad movie, whether you're talking Night Riders or Monkey Shines, or Diary of the Dead. I mean, I think they're all good films. The closest he came to making a bad movie, I think, was There's Always Vanilla, which isn't really a bad movie. It's just it's something is not completely firing on that one.
Hmm. Well, for me, I think what's really too bad is that George did spend a lot of years trying to get different films off that we never saw. So it's like when you look at that list of things
Mm-hmm.
that were never made, and specifically there were drafts and drafts of various versions of Twilight of the Dead and what became Land of the Dead, and I think I would imagine that through were you given access to those drafts when putting this book together?
I had access to some stuff, yeah. Um, I mean, most interestingly, I've seen his archives, which will be public relatively soon. At the University of Pittsburgh acquired them, and they're all being currently cataloged. So that's a thing that it feels kind of exclusive right now, but it won't be for long. And so I did get to see a lot of these drafts of these projects, you know, like The Stand and It, and then of the, I mean, how many do I list on page 639 in this book? I mean, there must be 50 or 60 projects here that he developed or full on wrote and never got made.
Well, right. And if you look at the list, for those of us who were following along through Fangoria at one time and then Ain't It Cool
Mm-hmm.
News later, it's like if you look at the list, let me see if these are all ones that, we as fans were like, teased on or given an
Right.
idea that he was working on these. And so it is really interesting to consider, like, what could have been if George had gotten more of the support from
Right.
the studios. But then would the films be significantly different? Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. It's like a push and pull, you know, like even like the Dark Half, which I agree with you is a really good movie. You know, that's one of his Hollywood movies, and they took it away from him. They redid the ending, and they did a lot of stuff that he wasn't happy with. So some of these big projects on here, stuff like his War of the Worlds movie and The Mummy and Tarzan and all these things that he worked on for a long time. You know, you wonder. You know, he was at his best, I think, when he was working independently. So, and when he did those few films that he did make in the Hollywood system, I don't think he had a very good time making them. They were filled with anguish for him. So it's hard to know. It's hard to know. I mean, it certainly as a fan, it's intriguing to want to see him work on a bigger canvas that he never got to. But that's what the book is. You know, I think he put a lot of his frustrations about the size of the stories he was allowed to tell into this book. And this book was really his chance to do an epic, and there'd be no concerns about budget for once.
Well, and those limitations sometimes provided or forced great creativity, especially
Yeah.
for people with Day of the Dead, which, the isolation and the, how trapped everyone is in that underground bunker leads to so much of the dynamics of it that make it, the movie that it is.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of us super fans have read the original Day of the Dead script, which was much bigger. But yeah, I wouldn't change Day of the Dead at all from what it is. I think it's, you know, it's my favorite of his zombie films. Um, and I just love it. And I love the fact that we're squeezed down into these really unappealing, dark, fluorescent lit tunnels, and everyone's just sort of exploding. You know, it really feels like a pandemic situation where we're all stuck inside and having to deal with each other. Whereas Night of the Living Dead, it was more like we're all thrown inside, but it's one night and we're, you know, tempers are rising. But once you get to dawn and even more like day, it's like the long haul. Like we are truly, you know, this isn't a one night stand anymore. This is a long, ugly marriage where we're stuck together in a dark space and we're driving each other insane.
Hmm. And you did an interesting thing in the author's note at the end, which is you did the timeline. And look, I have to admit, like I am a Romero fan to a degree, but I wouldn't say I'm a super fan. Like I know that Twilight of the Dead existed. I know that there was a bigger script for Day of the Dead, but I'm not the type of guy that would have chased it down because
Hmm.
I'm more of a John Carpenter super fan from that
Hmm.
era. But I appreciate his work and what he did. And I'm one of the people that's I know Land of the Dead is a bit divisive, but I'm a defender of Land of the Dead myself. Um, and I think that you know the original four Dead movies are the ones that I think capture the eras that they're made in more succinctly.
Hmm.
Uh, I now granted I've only seen Diary of the Dead and Survival of the Dead the one times that I saw them when they came out. So maybe there's deeper meaning that I didn't catch on to. But
Definitely Die of the Dead. Like he was 10 or 20 years ahead of his time with that one. Watch it now, it's gonna blow your mind. Like he was so ahead of his time with how social media and like viral video was going to affect us. It's amazing.
Okay. Well, now you told me that I need to go back and watch it because I wasn't a huge fan of that one when it came out, but and also because I can't stand found footage is just a personal thing I have to get over with that.
Yeah.
Even though, like, for example, Europa Report is a movie I really like, but it's still found footage and I still have a hard time with it. Um, but that's just me. That's a personal thing.
I get it.
But so when so you did dive into these older scripts. I'm not familiar. Like, how much bigger was that original Day of the Dead script? How much did he have to peel back there?
A lot. It felt in some way a lot. Some of the stuff he repurposed for Land of the Dead. Like
Mhm.
there was this kind of tiered society in Land of the Dead. It was it was literalized in a high rise, really. So you
Mhm.
had poor people living on the ground, and the higher you went in the building, the richer they were. So it had some of that kind of elements. There was an underground bunker, but then there were these. There was sort of a society on land, so it had that idea, but it was just bigger. It was just involved, you know, kind of the idea of, in some ways, like zombie armies. It would have involved a lot of people, instead of the very few people that Dawn of the Dead involved. I'm sorry, the filmed Day of the Dead involved.
Mhm. Well, it's interesting too because I think that it it is natural the way it scales down from Dawn of the Dead, right? Because Dawn of the
Hmm.
Dead is in the timeline is still closer, like maybe a week out, and so like the whole consumer thing and the mall and all that makes sense that to then have like because one of the things that I always loved about Day of the Dead is the feeling that the world may be empty.
Yeah.
It may be gone. That was one of the things that as a kid really struck me is that like when they go to Florida and they have that whole scene with the alligator and like there's no one there. And it could be already gone. And the idea that these last people in the bunker are some of the last people,
Yeah.
you know, that's truly frightening, just
Well, I mean, in the author's note, as I think you mentioned, I figured out what is really the order of the films, which is not the order that they come out in, that they were released. And in that order, Land of the Dead happens before Day of the Dead. So Day of the Dead is the final film in the chronology. D- Even though there's six films, it's the final film. So it does. That's the feeling that you're certainly left with,
Mhm.
is that
Now, is that a
underground bunker is the finale.
now is that a chronology that you feel makes sense, or is it one that George actually like in his mind he saw it that way?
Well, I mean, he saw it that way, so I have to make it make sense. Like
Right.
that was the order. Some of the so it goes night, diary, survival, dawn, land, day. So, and those are all taken from pretty definitive sources. They either say in the movie themselves when the this is 2 weeks after the zombie, or this is 2 years after the zombies. Um, in at least one case, I had to go to the screenplay to find out. Dawn was the trickiest because they don't really say it. You get a sense of it because the one-legged priest says something that gives you a sense that it's just been weeks. But in the novelization that Romero co-wrote, he makes it much more specific, so that was helpful. And sometimes I wouldn't know until the commentary tracks where Romero would say this takes place about 5 years after or whatever. So eventually I was able to assemble the correct timeline. And that was important for figuring out a lot of the things in the book, because I needed to figure out, put these movies in order and see what he was doing with them. What is the arc that is being built here?
And so, do you place this in the same Romero Dead universe, or
Oh yeah,
okay,
definitely. So if you wanted the full experience, this is what you should do. Watch Night, Diary, Survival, Dawn, Stop, read. Yeah, that's right. Stop, read the book up through Act 1. I'm trying to remember how this goes. It's not as complicated as I'm making it sound. Basically, there's a space in the book where I've allowed the movies to exist. The book has a very short Act 2. It's a 3-act book, and the beginning of Act 2 is where all the movies would go. So if you wanted to make it simpler, read Act 1 of the book, stop, watch all 6 movies in the order that I list them, and then go back to Acts 2 and 3 of the book.
all right. So I'll probably pull that out as a clip to make sure to give people the best instructions for reading.
I mean, even I haven't done it that way. I just know that that's the chronology. Next time I want to watch all the movies, which is going to be a while, I'm going to do it that way.
Great. Well, and I feel too that for people who have seen the movies many times, like it's a good, you're gonna feel connected to this universe. And like there was no time at this that I didn't feel like, and I guess this is one of the best compliments that I can give you, is that I know George probably only wrote a third of this before he passed, but it definitely felt, I could feel the Romero kind of universe throughout the whole thing. And
That's because I think that's partly due to the fact that the stuff that he wrote isn't limited to the first third. His stuff is placed all throughout the book, including the very end. And then he of course left some notes too. So there was this, it would have been a lot easier if he had just written part of the book and stopped and I wrote the rest of it. That would have been much simpler. But that's not how it was. The material, once we gathered it, was dotted throughout the plot of the book, which forced me in a good way to always have to return to the next spot on the timeline that he had kind of laid out.
okay, so we'll get into all the nuts and bolts. We're going to put it up on the lift and get into spoilers now. Is there anything else you want to say to people who might be pausing it and coming back after reading it? Like last pitch to say, this is why you should, read this book.
Well, I mean, for Romero fans, it sort of ends the story. I mean, that would be the only pitch I would need. I mean, it does present a vision of George's of how he is going to reboot the story the same as he did in Diary of the Dead, start from day one, and take it through the end. The movies only ever went 5 years out. This book goes 15 and does kind of end it. So if you want to see that, and who wouldn't? I mean, this is a 50-year saga that began in 1968. So yeah, I mean, that's my pitch.
Okay, now I would say too that I've always said that it's a lot like I'm very annoyed by Star Trek fans who get very upset about, and I'm a big Star Trek fan, that why don't the Klingons' heads all look the same from one show to the other? And it's like I'm always, in your mind, you have to update the technology when you watch the original series. You just have to. And I think with the Romero films too, to think of them all as one timeline, don't think about, don't focus so much on the 70s stuff when you're watching Dawn of the Dead. Don't focus so much.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
you know,
you have to. That's what
yeah,
Romero did. He ignored the decade shifts. Night of the Living Dead takes place in 1968. Dawn of the Dead doesn't come out to 1979, but it's just a couple weeks later.
mhm.
So you just have to ignore the decade shifts, which is an interesting thing that I've never seen in another series. But it allowed him to comment on it. But there is a chronological timeline. You just have to ignore kind of chronological reality in a way.
Yeah, you need to give yourself up to the story, which which is actually the way you have to take every story if you really think about it. And I also think it's kind of crucial and important for this novel too, to kind of set yourself in the mindset that that those films are kind of informing the universe in which you
Hmm.
live when you're reading the book, and that's the best way to read it, in my opinion. Um,
Yeah.
as somebody who just spent the last week reading it, um, and the funny thing is, I'm a very fast reader, and it still took
Yeah, it's a long book.
it still took me a week, but I enjoyed every bit of it. So, all right, so we're now in spoilers. So let's talk about the writing process. So you did touch a little bit on this,
Mhm.
but and you lay this all out great in the author's notes, but I think to kind of discuss it is a little something else that's interesting for readers or for other writers. I don't think many writers are going to get into this exact situation. However,
Yeah.
it is fascinating how you did this. So he had provided about one third of what you needed for the book, although it wasn't front loaded. It was stuff that was mostly in the back end. So we're going to assume now that people listening this far have read it. And so I'm wondering, was this the Canadian parts? Was this the 15 years later that he had focused a lot of his energy on writing when
It again, it was spread out. There was a big chunk of it at the beginning um, that deals with primarily dealt with the characters in the morgue and the characters aboard the aircraft carrier, and then the TV studio. Um, but then there were other elements that we eventually roped in that were didn't were not located anywhere specific,
Mhm.
but with some differences. Like we did have a cue to how it should end, like a pretty strong cue of the last few pages of the book.
Yeah,
Um,
and we'll get to the ending in a
yeah.
bit, but now I'm interested in, did he have an actual outline that he was working for, like even an act structure or any of that?
It was, I wouldn't call it, I mean, certainly that wouldn't rate next to what I consider an outline because my outlines are extremely thorough.
Mhm.
He had, you have to think about it as he had parts of a manuscript that were missing a lot of connective tissue. And then he had some notes. These notes were casual. They mostly came in the form of a letter or just a document that was, I don't remember how many pages, 13 pages, something like that, where he just sort of in a paragraph style, just sort of says where he's going with some of the characters and saying, this is where this plot will go. This is where these two characters are going to do this and this and this. Um, and so we had all of these elements, and some of them were completely disconnected. Like he had written this short story that I kind of rediscovered um, that had only ever been published on his short-lived website around the year 2000. So there are other elements that were completely external to this novel that we got permission to incorporate into it. So there were elements that were awesome and fit, but didn't have a particular place. So
Mhm.
they had to be worked on and massaged. And there were definitely parts where I had to figure out how to mesh all this stuff together. That was the biggest challenge. And occasionally juggle things like, can this character be that character? Can these two people be the same character? Or can this action that he had assigned to this character, I don't see how that's going to work. Can we reassign that action to a character 300 pages down the line? Because I didn't want to, I desperately didn't want to get rid of the stuff he had written. There were a couple cases where I had to, but I tried my hardest to save every bit of prose that I could. And so I would move it around and be creative when I needed to.
And that must have been like putting a puzzle together. And
Oh yeah.
I would think that was a kind of unique, fun thing to do as a writer, to like try and plot something that was already kind of desperate. And
yeah,
I mean, George probably had a plan for it, but you had to guess, right? And you had to,
Yep. But I had a lot of, my guesses were all very informed, like in the author's note, I go into detail about how I came to the decisions and the choices that I made, so that, I'm pretty transparent about it. So if someone disagrees, they can at least see my reasoning for why I decided. And a lot of that had to do with just studying George as a person and figuring out what.
I'm wondering about some nuts and bolts, nitty gritty. Was he typing, handwriting?
Mm-hmm. He was typing. Depending on the age of the work, most of it was computer. I feel like there was at least some element that was typed, like on a typewriter.
Clive Barker still to this day handwrites everything.
Yeah, that's amazing. No handwriting here though.
Yeah, okay. Because I know he's kind of a Luddite to a degree, so I didn't know he was.
He was, but he seemed to take to writing on a computer. He was okay with that. It was more the technology of connectivity that he was against.
Right. Well, yeah, but I think it's a fair question, because it would have been more complicated for you if you didn't have, for example, a Word document that you were working from. And just on a nuts and bolts level, like, did you have a document that was like kind of locked in stone? Did you have to retype things? Did you?
I had like PDFs of things that I then had to very roughly use software to transfer to Word. I think there are programs that do this, but I just use like free programs, so they transferred horribly. So I'd have to go through and do tons of little fixes. But everything was edited too, though. So it's to make our styles mesh, I had to go through all of his work and make minor edits in all of his sentences too, so that I could create a style that was the Kraus and Romero style.
Yeah. Which must have I'm sure the first time you said that to yourself, or had that thought, you're like, wow, this is pretty.
Yeah, it's a heady thought, but there was so much work to be done that I just focused really hard and just tried not to think of the wildness of what was happening.
Yeah. And I did listen to your interview with Brian Keene, and so I did kind of hear some of this, but the archaeology that you had to do to find these things that were on the website in the early 2000s, because it wasn't just like, oh, it's saved, I can just Google it. You had it's on websites that don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And he didn't have that in his files, which is interesting. So you had to, and that was like almost 100 pages, correct?
Yeah, there was I used the Wayback Machine on the internet to find bits of his old site that hasn't existed for 20 years or something. And on that site, there was evidence that he was sending out bits of a story, a longer zombie story. But you had to send in $2 or something like that, and he'd email it to you. So the actual story wasn't there, but there was evidence that it existed. So then I got with his wife, and we tried to figure out who might have those bits of story. So there was definitely a Indiana Jones element to digging up all the artifacts.
Right. So the structure of the novel is really interesting. Just as like, let's forget the who wrote when where. Let's just look at it as a finished work for a second. It reminded me a little bit of my favorite science fiction novel of the 20th century is John Brunner's Stand on Zanzibar. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it.
No, I'm not.
Okay, yeah. So the structure of this book kind of reminded me a little bit of Stand on Zanzibar, because what Stand on Zanzibar does is that's a doorstop novel too.
Uh-huh.
And it was written in 1969 about overpopulation. And John Brunner's inspiration was in the 30s. There was this trilogy of books called the USA trilogy by John Don Passos. And it was,
No.
yeah, and apparently it was like the literary novel of the 30s.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard of the author, definitely.
Yeah, right. And so it's funny because I kept thinking about that lineage, because what you have with the USA trilogy and Stand on Zanzibar is you have all these different characters that are showcasing world building for an entire
Mm-hmm.
universe and showing the entire world building, and they all seem desperate. They don't seem connected. And for hundreds of pages, these characters are on their own track.
Right.
And unlike Stand on Zanzibar, they don't come together quite as well. So in the first half, I was thinking, oh, this is kind of Stand on Zanzibar, but the characters do come together. Was that do you George had created some of these characters that are on
Yes.
their own, but he always had the intention of bringing them together, correct?
That was the indication I got from his notes. It wasn't, I didn't have confirmation that it was, I knew some of the characters, but I didn't know all of the characters that he was going to have meet up. So some of that was up to me. But yeah, that seemed to be the structure he was laying out in the book, like really focused on a set of characters for a while, and then to another set of characters for a while. And that's how the book plays out. It's almost like some novellas, almost like there's almost like 100 pages of these set, and then 100 pages of another set, and you introduce 4 of those sets before starting to get to this point where they're meeting each other.
Right. Well, it's funny because when I made the Stand on Zanzibar comparison to a friend who was also reading the book this last week, um, it was funny because he said the same thing too, and I said, "Well, I don't." And now that I know that you have read it, I do wonder if George had read Stand on Zanzibar, because
Who's the author of it?
John Brunner, and it was the Hugo Award-winning novel of 1969. So it was well known, and it's a novel about overpopulation. And but one thing that's really interesting about Stand in Zanzibar is it predicts school shootings
Oh, interesting.
and mass shootings, because it kind of there's a one of the kind of novellas in the middle of it is kind of talks about this idea. And so it's funny because I do think, and I bring up Stand in Zanzibar for a specific reason, because there were 2 or 3 times, and I'm assuming now that they must have been George parts, but there was at least one, and I dog-eared it, but I'm not sure which one it was. But there was one time where I raised my eyebrow and thought,
Huh.
I think George read Stand on Zanzibar.
I'd be curious to know what part. You can tell me later.
Yeah, it's one of the scenes with the it's with Luis and
Mm-hmm.
Charlie early on, because there's the whole idea of the shotgun marriage. There's a scene in San Zanzibar where characters get isolated, right? And this later informs things that are going on later in Living Dead, and this same trick was used in Stand in Zanzibar. So
that section is probably mostly me though.
okay, so that
Because,
might have been an accident.
yeah, I think that might be an accident. What's interesting about that section is some of it is taken from George's life. Sort of a hallmark of some of the stuff that I wrote in the book was kind of referencing and honoring, hopefully, just George as a person. And that section, once I found out that Louise was a pet name of his wife when George was being troublesome. She would call him Luis. And then I kind of realized, oh, Luis is sort of the George character here, and
Mhm.
Charlie is sort of like his wife, and that actually changed how I wrote that section, how I approached it, knowing about their life and how he died and all that sort of thing.
Let me make that connection a little bit more clear, even though it's more, I think, an accident because there's a part that you wrote. But in Sands of Zanzibar, there's characters early in the book that remind me of Luis and Charlie in the sense that their story seems minuscule in the beginning, but
Hmm.
they're very connected to a lot of the events that kick off the whole thing.
Yeah.
That's the comparison that I saw to Stand on Zanzibar. Now,
Yeah.
that thread with Luis and Charlie is my favorite part of the book. And I don't know, I would say the shotgun marriage and the scene with the finger being bit off
Hmm.
and all that, which, by the way, takes place in San Diego, where I live.
Oh,
So,
very nice.
it's funny, my co-author on a project I'm working on, he's from La Mesa, and he gave me this really weird look because he asked me how the book was, and I said, "Well, my favorite chapter takes place in La Mesa, from La Mesa."
Yeah, I mean, George, I don't know why he said it there, but he did.
Well, I think I know why he did because I had to explain this, and I think it's because he had to have the aircraft carrier off the coast
Mm,
of where they were. It seems like
interesting.
that's why he would do that.
Yeah, that makes some sense.
Yeah, and I'm just speaking as somebody in San Diego who knows the Navy is huge here.
Yeah, yeah, interesting.
So I think that's why he did it. But that whole scene with the marriage and the finger
Hmm.
biting out the finger and the delay and the bag over the head.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, to me that was the most powerful and most effective chapter in the book. For me, it was the one that
yeah.
hit the hardest.
It's for me too. I mean, that's a chapter that I wrote.
Mhm.
So I'm saying this about myself, but I do think it's uh, the kind of the most crushing uh, bit of the book. I think it's kind of surprising and really heartbreaking.
Well, and speaking as somebody who has also written a zombie novel too, um, and knows that it's hard to come up with original things at this point that haven't been done, and there's a couple of those in here, and one of the most original to me was the whole idea that Lewis suggests to her the bag over the head so she doesn't have to look at him
Hmm.
when she ends his life. Is
Yeah,
That was particularly heartbreaking.
yeah. It's sad. It's
Yeah,
really sad.
and I know I posted this on Facebook because I read that chapter on election night
Uh,
when everyone was agonizing over what the final count would be, and I
yeah.
was too. I said, okay, well, one thing that helped me was I read this heartbreaking chapter,
Oh,
on this night, and it distracted me for a while because and then I did have the thought to myself, well, it could be worse, right?
yeah. Yeah, it could be.
Right. And so I did have that going on. But so yeah, so that storyline too. And I do think that the Olympia storyline with the aircraft carrier was why he set them off the coast of San Diego and
Yeah,
why.
that's really interesting because if the book doesn't go that way, but it could have, that aircraft carrier I think was bound for San Diego. So that's a great point.
Well, but they eject out and they had the whole action scene, which was incredible, by the way. And also, that sounds like that was a George thing. The idea of like, wouldn't it be crazy to have a pilot go zombie while we're in the air?
Yep, that was George. Yeah.
Yeah, and that sounds like, man, I wish I never had the budget to do this. So,
Oh yeah, and then he lands and there's alligators and I mean it's yeah, he was full on going
yeah,
crazy with some of that stuff.
yeah, and so that seemed like a fun thing, but I do think that they gave them some symmetry, and maybe I'm just reading into that because I live in San Diego, but I think the symmetry of them being off the coast and then the first John Doe being here,
Hmm.
and then I'm going to take a little bit that's to say, hey, we San Diego, we started it all.
You
Uh,
did. Congratulations.
Yeah. And so tell me about writing that chapter because that had to be interesting because we've never seen in all the Romero universe, we've never seen Ground Zero, right? So that you had to feel some responsibility there.
So the chapter in the morgue.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was really pretty strongly laid out by George. Like that, there was, plenty that I filled in and expanded on. But all the plot beats at that one were from George. So yeah, it was interesting to see if he's going to have a patient zero zombie person, like where's he going to put that, and who is going to be there to witness it. And it is interesting to see, all right, he's going to put it in a morgue in San Diego, and I can't pretend to know exactly why. But he did have what we do know is he wanted certain people there to witness it, and he wanted a Latino character named Luis, and he wanted his assistant Charlene, who have kind of an attraction, but it's kind of one way from Charlene in a way, and he had them, he wanted them to react in a certain way towards the zombie that, once the whole project was taken in consideration, did make me think certain things about it. Like late in the book, Charlie's ponders on the idea of, what if we had reacted to that first zombie differently? Like, what if we hadn't reacted to it out of anger? Like, what if this were like the test balloon, like the alien ship that comes to check out and make sure the humans are peaceful, and what we did was we immediately tried to beat it and destroy it, and maybe that set off the whole thing. Maybe we're partly to blame.
Well, and Charlie's journey becomes one of the most interesting as a character from beginning to end too. Once we get to Canada, but we'll talk about Canada a little bit more coming up. But the Olympia storyline, so that was a George storyline that did originate with him.
Yeah.
Yeah, the aircraft carrier. But did the whole the story with the pastor and was that there?
No, the pastor was me, and that was one of the parts where I was taking control of issues that I thought were important to George, and certain things about how he felt about a religion, and and a lot of this stuff is less difficult than it seems. Like George and I are so close in how we think about things, and maybe it's because he was someone I'd been following since I was 5 years old. So a lot of his beliefs have become my beliefs. So there are parts in the book where I'm, where there were gaps, where I would look at George and his work and his life and his beliefs, and try to use those gaps productively to bring up issues that he might have had he been around.
And yeah, because that character, he reminded me a little bit of like Mrs. Carmody from The Mist, or where like
yeah right
and in a great way.
Yeah.
And surprising too. And like one of the things I liked about his character is that when he's first introduced, the pastor, like I didn't see that coming from him, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I think there's a tendency for some people to like, if they're going to end up twirling their mustache, they have to twirl their mustache from the beginning.
Right.
And what I appreciated about what you did with that character was that I got some sympathy for him early on. So when things kind of went crazy, I kind of, it's like the difference of between The Shining, the movie, and The Shining, the book. Like one of the reasons why I'm a book guy and not a movie guy is that Jack Torrance is crazy from the first scene in the movie, and I would never hire him to go to the Overlook.
Yeah.
But in the book, I feel bad for him, and I'm like, don't do it. And I think what I liked about it was Bill, right? Father Bill.
Yeah.
Or Pat. Yeah. What I liked about him was that like it was more like Jack Torrance in the book, where I saw it coming, but I'm like, God, dude, don't do it. Don't do it.
Well, that's something that was very evident in his pages. Like the parts of his writing that he was really, the parts where I could tell he was really excited were not the zombie parts. They were the parts where he was talking about characters, and in particular talking about sort of the bad sides of good characters. Like he seemed to be very interested and very dedicated to making complicated characters that we wouldn't necessarily always know how to feel about. And that's something that I'm kind of obsessed with in my own writing. So I into that, and yeah, Father Bill is certainly an example of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and I thought that he added a lot of strength to that part. Dealing with the animals,
Mm-hmm.
like, and I know Keane did it a little bit, or did it in The Rising. So we've seen zombie animals a little
I
bit.
still haven't read The Rising. I get it recommended to me like weekly.
Well, it's funny. I haven't read The Rising since it came out. Like,
I get two recommendations constantly: The Rising and The Reapers Were the Angels, I think it's called.
hmm.
Yeah, it's another zombie book, and I get those two recommendations all the time. I need to buckle down and read them.
You're right. Well, I think The Rising is the first time that I saw zombie animals, and um, one of the funny things too is that if you follow Keane's work, is that his sequel to The Rising and Land of the Dead kind of came out at the same time.
Yeah, I remember hearing that on this podcast, I think.
Yeah, and they have very similar like kind of directions where they were thinking on the same thing. But Brian is a devotee of George as much as anybody,
Yeah.
so it's natural that he would have like a similar track. But
Yeah, I had to try to really careful with the animal thing because although I dug up tons of evidence that I think that's where George was headed next, he had never touched on it in any of his movies that he actually made.
well, and I liked the character that had the suit set up with um, specifically spikes on her boots specifically
Mm-hmm.
uh, for zombie rats was an interesting little detail of world building. And without,
Yeah, she would put spikes on her the table that she slept on, so they couldn't climb up the table legs at night.
yeah, that's interesting too, because we have a mouse in our house right now that keeps climbing up to eat tomatoes.
Oh no.
And but we're animal people, so we're not that concerned about it. But
Good.
but yeah, and so I think once that I think there's a line later on in the book that was really great where one of the characters said, I hope we get dogs back. I really miss dogs.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, which was a really was a line that really struck with me. Um, and this idea that one of the things that they lost in this world was this kinship and this connection with dogs.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you're mentioning all the things that really stick with me. I think that scene with Louise and Charlie we mentioned, and then there's part where the animals start turning, and there's a line that's something like, "Losing dogs felt like losing the war," where it's just like they had these loyal friends and protectors who were with them, and then suddenly they had to kill them. They couldn't trust them. Like if they were to die or get hurt, they would have a zombie dog on their hands. So that yeah, that's that for some reason, anything violence or anything involving dogs always seems to cut to the heart.
Right. And that's I think that seeing that's one of the reasons why that part of the story like worked really, really well. And I do think when once we get to Canada and we get to the 11 years after, what were your main concerns with the world building of doing that last act?
Right. So once I had kind of gamed out the arc of zombies, which again had to do with arranging the original zombie movies and then playing it out, just playing out the numbers. Like there was going to come up time, by my calculations, about 15 years, where zombies would have nothing. There would be no zombies being created anymore. Like the few people that were left would have rules in place where if someone died, they'd immediately, damage their brains. They couldn't come back. So there would be no zombies being created, and the zombies have nothing really more to eat, and the zombies themselves would start to die out. They would just start to rot, fall down, and turn back into the soil. So what became critical to me there is we had seen many times Romero's visions of a dystopia. Like we saw how he saw the world falling apart. But that sort of begs the question of what then was his vision of utopia? Like if we know, boy, do we ever know all the things that he saw that were negative in the world that would lead to its collapse. But what's the opposite of that? What was his solution? He never got to show us, but I pulled together what I know of him and his work and his thoughts and combined it with my own and said, all right, so if we had a chance to start over, and this book says we do because the zombies are dying out, and we have a chance here to restart humanity and create a utopia. What would that look like? And so that was a big thought process of just figuring out, what does the Romero Kraus utopia look like? Who founds it? How does it function? What's our best shot at doing this right next time?
Now, and a lot of what you were saying was George's intention in doing this was that he wanted to have his final say. He wanted to end this story that he had started 50 years earlier. And do you think the end was this period where, and Charlie, I think, is the key one because correct me if I'm wrong, but she goes to the hospice, which was a great scene because she thinks she's bit and she goes to the hospice, which is this great idea that there's this place where they let people quietly go zombie or whatever, die, and because they might transform or whatever. And then she thinks she's a goner, but it just doesn't happen. Is that
Mm-hmm.
is that the end you think that George was looking towards? Is like a time where this is just over now? We're just
Yeah, I think it's, and the author note lays this out, but it's a possibility. Yeah, I think it's at the end of the day, it's my interpretation of where he was going, but I think it's a valid interpretation that I back up as best as I can. Um, we definitely know that he was open, to it ending well, and for people being able to escape the plague, and the plague somehow ending. Although again, I shouldn't use the word plague because really, he saw it more of as an uprising, a sort of good thing in a way, a cleansing of the earth rather than a plague. So yeah, I do think that's kind of where he was heading. And then more specifically, the final chapter in the book is really right from George. Like that's really how he wanted the book to end.
We'll get to
Yeah.
that, but there was
Yeah.
a line on page 517, and I dog-eared it and wrote in pencil on it, and it goes, people, zombies, we're all dying, he said gently. Here's what we need to accept. We're smart zombies as much as they are dumb humans. Any second now, those two lines are going to converge, and us and them will be exactly the same, body and soul together. I can feel it. The chief can feel it. All Slowtown can feel it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's a great line to pull out. I think that's a lot of the thesis right there. The idea that zombies and people are sort of two halves of the same thing, and one element got out of control, the humans, and the zombies were sent to sort of right the scales. And then at some point, though, and this happens about 15 years out, there's going to be a point where the zombies have done their job and the people have course corrected just enough that there's going to be a moment of reckoning, and then the test becomes, how do we treat the zombies at that point? Once we have managed to tip the scales just enough, so now that we're 50, it's sort of like the Congress, now that we've got 51% control, are we going to steamroll the 49%, or are we going to work with them?
Right. And I feel good about that because I haven't posted my review, but I've written most of it. And um, that quote that I just read is kind of the thesis of my review.
Hmm. Yeah. No, that's great. I hadn't, no one's pointed that passage out before, but it's kind of almost the critical passage.
Now, is
I mean,
that,
it's as close as it gets to laying it all out in
do you think
sort
that
of front.
was that a George line, or did you write that?
No, this passage is mine. Um, this is me getting as explicit with the idea behind the book as I get, I think.
And with some time to go, because it's 5:17, so
Hmm.
that's interesting. And so let's talk about that ending a little bit. And that you said I know in the author notes you said the last three words were entirely George's.
Hmm.
So, but it didn't come specifically from his attempt at this novel, right? It came from
No,
a different source.
it came from a very, very old source. So basically, I mean, if you're deep into Romero, you know this, but it's a pretty obscure fact that his original zombie trilogy, Night, Dawn, Day, was sketched out by him before he even made Night. And he essentially wrote this short story. It was not a short story that he ever published or anything like that. And it's been lost to time. But he would speak about it in interviews, how he wrote the short story as a young man that was about kind of an uprising, but where one element of society in three different chapters overtakes another. And he in an interview, I finally found an interview where he says what the last three words of that story were. And so, sort of in honor of that, I made that the last three words of this story. But the whole last scene was also George, and it was part of the fiction, the literature that he wrote that we used for this book. And he did want it to end where it ended, and with the characters that are in that final scene.
Right, and the line specifically is, "For now the dead sink, for now the dead die, for now the dead win." Right.
Yeah. So you're gonna have to wrestle with that one a little bit because it seems counterintuitive. They're sinking, they're dying, but they're winning. Like, what does that mean? And that's purposely a little bit tricky.
Um, right. The idea is that the dead are disappearing from this world because
Hmm.
we're getting past it, but they win in the sense that they have remade the world. They've, and look, we
Hmm.
saw a little bit about this early in the, you know, in the lockdowns for COVID. My wife and I constantly remarked about how it was so much better for the planet that we got
Oh yeah.
a month to
Yep.
stop, and no air traffic, no, just that the pollution was stopping, and all those things. And so I thought a lot about that with this ending, because with this line that the dead win in this
Yeah.
regard.
And
And
that's a great thing. That's a great fact to point out because then really more than almost than anything that's happened in 2020 that reflects from this book, it's that to me. Like there's a huge thread of this book that is really about how humanity has destroyed the planet, and these zombies are here to we're the plague destroying the planet, and the zombies are here to act as the antibodies.
well, George always saw the dead as representing the working class, and that is very clear, and especially Dawn of the Dead, more than any other one, that the anti-consumerism and that kind of thing. And so we look, and I did it on a very minor scale, and I don't mean to promote my own work, but I did a zombie novel 10 years ago, a satire called The Vegan Revolution with Zombies. It was my first book with Eraserhead Press, and in my book it was, the Romero movies were a reference point. The
Hmm.
characters refer to them, and there's direct analogies to. And part of the joke is because it takes place in Portland, and the characters haul up in the vegan mini mall, right? Which is kind of a joke and reference to Dawn of the
Yeah.
Dead. And I had lots of. It was funny because my book, if you know vegan culture, there's parts that will work for you. That
Right.
if you know Romero, there's parts that will work for you. And if you know Portland, there's parts that will work for you. But the funny thing is like, I think I'm the only person in the world that gets all of it.
Right. Yeah, that happens.
Yeah. And, but one of the funny things too is that I had to wrestle with this a little bit too, is the idea that, you know, I was writing where the Romero movies existed as movies,
Yep.
right? And you had to write this where the zombie culture didn't exist, right? So you had to make some specific decisions in relation to that. But I think most importantly here, and what I'm getting at, and I'm talking a lot, I'm sorry, but I'm trying to get to the point of what I think was so crucial about the ending of this book is that you are finally answering so many questions. It's like there's 6 movies of questions.
Yeah.
In the final act here, you are providing the answer that George was meaning to write. So that's heavy
Yeah.
stuff, right?
Yeah, for at least through my interpretive lens, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. But you got the seal of approval from the Romero family. So I'm assuming his wife, you had to
Yeah.
speak with her about the last act, I'm sure. And what
Yeah. I mean, it's all legit. But yeah, I mean, it's I guess I'm just feeling humble, but yeah, you're right.
No. Take a victory lap here because look, you know, I'm not the super fan that you are. I am a more casual Romero fan, although you know, I definitely have seen Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead enough times that I can say the lines of the movie as they're happening. I can do that with the original 3 trilogy. I was, you know, there first day for Land of the Dead, and I definitely, you know, I have love for what George did. So I am one of those people that was rooting for you and wanted you to succeed with ending the story. And I would say, from my perspective, you nailed it. And I'm not saying this just because, you know, and I know you said you had the tough job because if you succeed, then everyone's going to say that a boy, George, and if you
Yeah.
fail, they're gonna come with pitchforks for you.
Right.
And but I, as a writer, know the task that you had to do and the pressure that you had, and so and I really appreciate specifically as much as my favorite parts of the book were early, like the Louise storyline was my favorite. I appreciate the challenge and what you had to do with the utopia at the end.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So, and I would say, so the last thing that I would want to say, well, and I will point out something that specifically for me as a San Diegan, there's a line on page 270 that I cannot not mention,
Uh-oh.
which is Louise opens his Twitter, his heavily filtered profile pic of him flashing pearly whites at the last Pride parade, which, by the way, San Diego has a great Pride weekend and is well known for that. Trying too hard not to read his too hard the bio. San Diego assistant medical examiner slash artist slash still liking the Chargers. There are very few people who still like the Chargers in San Diego. I just have to say,
Well, that's why he had to put it in there. he's being proud about it. He's like, I still like them, although most of you don't.
Right, which was funny because I very specifically, I was one of the activists that fought to keep the team here.
Yeah.
I actually am the co-founder of Save Our Bolts, and militantly anti-Spanos and anti-Chargers. So there, I will admit that when I read that line, I went "Urgh,"
Yeah.
when I saw that. But I'm not mad at you. I'm mad that there are still people like that because there are a few who stuck with
Yes.
Chargers.
All right. I understood. Point taken.
But it's good world building. So as a writer, I can't argue with a very specific piece of world building where you
Yeah.
had at Pride and still
Yeah.
liking the Chargers is good San Diego world buildings.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I both love and hate that part.
All right. Good enough.
So so we're almost done, but I just to wrap things up on a spoiler level, what was the hardest challenge for you to meld the stuff that was already written with the stuff that you had to create?
I think on a real sort of two answers, but on a technical level, the Navy stuff, the aircraft carrier was the most difficult because George had clearly done a bunch of research, but I didn't have any of that research. I don't know what he was. I don't know what his research documents were. We didn't have them, and I didn't know anything about aircraft carriers, the Navy. I didn't know anything. So, and that section is very tech heavy, very specific, filled with detail, and I wanted to be able to continue with that detail. So I had to spend just a lot of time researching aircraft carriers, which is, I mean, it's not like you're researching a boat, you're researching a city. I mean, there's a million things going on inside an aircraft carrier. It's a floating city. So that was difficult. And then probably the other big difficulty was really in just how I didn't want to cut anything. And that was more of far less technical and more emotional, where I just didn't want to lose we had such a finite amount of his work that it felt precious. And it was difficult for me to cut things. So I worked so hard trying to find new ways to use bits. But there, there were at least a couple sequences that I did have to cut, and that hurt, but I couldn't get around it.
Right. Well, and I appreciate the work that you did on this, and I imagine you approached this with a lot of. I can't imagine you could not have approached this with the equal amounts of fear and excitement.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Because and you knew that this. I mean, you're closing the book on a story that started with the first movie that you ever seen.
Yeah, I know, it's wild.
Is a unique experience for somebody, and so I'm sure reflecting back on that at the end, like, had to be.
It's beyond belief. I still can't really believe it. It
Right.
feels like the closing of a circle. It feels like, in a way, I can die happy now. Like I've closed a giant life circle of my own.
Yeah. Well, we want more Daniel Kraus books, so don't do that.
Okay, don't worry. I have many more coming up.
Right. And what's interesting too, and then it kind of, I wish I'd done this before spoilers, but I'm not a huge fan of The Walking Dead, and I'm guilty because I wrote a zombie novel a while ago, but I'm one of those people that's like, enough already, for the most part. And but there was never any doubt that I was going to read this because of specifically what it was. But what would you say to the idea of? Well, I guess we've already answered this a bunch. The difference here is, and the reason why this exists is because it is closing the circle that specifically George.
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same way you do. Like I'm not a huge Walking Dead fan. I think I watched maybe 2 seasons of it. And I had no intent in ever writing a zombie novel. There's just so much out there. The only zombie novel I would have considered writing is this one, and that this was a ridiculous idea that I would ever get to. So yeah, this is, and of course, Romero, who started the whole thing, he had no interest in doing what you need to do today to write a zombie novel, which is create some new spin on it. Like, zombies can fly now, or whatever. You're gonna come up with some crazy new wrinkle. He invented these damn things. He was going to tell his story straightforward and just with more heart and depth than anyone else. And so he wasn't going to expand the idea in some wild new way. He was just going to tell it better than anyone.
Right. And in my own defense, you
Oh,
know,
sure. It makes sense.
right. In my own defense, because I'm the same way, you know, like what happened with me was that my editor, or one of my editors, uh, Carlton Mellick, the third, um, the author of The Haunted Vagina, uh, but Carlton being, you know, he basically called me up and he said, zombie books sell, vegan books sell, you're a vegan horror writer. He's like,
Interesting.
you know, I want you to do this. And then at first I told him I think it's a terrible idea. And then he said, well, we'll give you 4 other books.
Well, that's a good
If you
deal.
write this one. And then
Yeah.
I was like, okay, give me 2 weeks to come up with something. And basically in my situation, what happened was is that I was sitting in the horror section and I heard 2 teenage young ladies talking about Pride and Prejudice with zombies, and it made me mad.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, how can I make fun of this? And so the main character of my book is a editor of a with zombies line.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And when it all happens, and so I got a chance to make fun of some of this too.
Yeah,
Uh,
you went total meta. Yeah.
yes, exactly. And but what I appreciate here is that you know you're in the same, but I was the same thing. Like Walking Dead, I couldn't make it past 2 seasons. I did like the first season of Fear the Walking Dead because it was right at the beginning, and I thought they did some interesting things with LA. But for the most part, like I'm over zombies, and this book worked for me because
Mm-hmm.
I think, and I know you wrote a good chunk of this, but I, as I said early on, I think that it feels like it's closing the circle for Romero,
Yeah, totally.
and so, and I also don't generally like doorstop books anymore. Like 700-page books, that usually turn me off because I'm always saying, like, in my head, I'm always thinking, well, here's the 100 pages that could have been cut, or here's the 200
Mm-hmm.
pages that could have gone. And I never felt that way reading this because I felt like um, it was doing its job. So
Thank you.
so I want to commend you on that as well. And my review will be coming out soon, but and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you too specifically. Like, I know there's interviews out there with you, but I wanted to drill down on those things that were in your author notes.
No,
So
that's great. Thank you.
yeah, and so last thing I would say is tell us, how working on this project has influenced what you have going on in the future, and what is that you have going on in the future.
Boy, that's how has it influenced me? I mean, it does feel like, in a way, a weird weight is off, because it was something where, although I didn't, never knew that I was going to be involved with something like this, uh, it does feel like it's some sort of life goal that's vanished now, and in a good way. And I can see it, and look at it, and say there was something productive that I did that didn't really, has to do with me, but was really about honoring this person who meant so much to me. It was kind of a father figure to me. As far as what I've got coming out, it's the usual mix of everything. I just put out a book for middle grade kids called They Threw Us Away, which is sort of a Watership Down with teddy bears, but it's very, very dark. And I've got a comic book coming out right now called The Autumnal. It's an adult horror comic. And then a bunch of stuff that's not announced yet, but should be soon.
All right, cool. Well, we'll make sure that everyone's following that. Daniel, I really appreciate taking the deep dive on this book. I know this was a labor of love, and it shows on the page. And what's funny is, this is going to sound like a backhanded compliment, but thank you for not breathing new life into the
Yeah,
zombie genre.
that was kind of the intent. Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you understand. Thank you.
Yeah, because thank you for making me feel like I was um, in George's hands
Yeah.
for a good portion of this. Because, and the good thing is that there's no point where I'm sitting there saying, oh yeah, that's definitely Daniel's parts and that's definitely George's parts. You know, like I'm not, you know, there's no point where kind of I felt that when I read the author's notes, there were certain things that I thought were George's that were kind of confirmed. Like, because I did feel like he was wanting to have fun with the I don't have a budget, so
Oh yeah.
I can go wild with this.
Yeah.
And we definitely and it's funny that you said you had to cut a few of those parts too because they just didn't work, but he was obviously having fun writing something.
Yeah, I'll leave it to listeners to read the author's note. But there's one totally bonkers sequence that I couldn't make fit, but it is wild.
Right. And that had to hurt, but
oh yeah. I'm hoping somehow it can be shared with the world at some point in some other form.
Right. All right. Well, I really appreciate you giving us the time today to because I do think, you know, next time, you know, I don't know, maybe somebody will finish a Wes Craven novel at some point. Like, oh, now I can use this interview to.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? I know Wes Craven wrote a novel, so maybe there's another one out there.
Right. Maybe there's an or half-written prequel to Hills Have Eyes.
Who knows?
Can you know, finally finish, but wouldn't that be interesting? But yeah, I really appreciate your time and thank you for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.